The wind howled across the San Pedro Valley like a wounded animal that wouldn't die. It carried snow, sharp, blinding flakes that stung the skin and buried the world in white silence. Nora Whitfield leaned her shoulder against the cabin door, pushing it shut with a grunt, her arms trembling from hauling wood in the storm. The fire in the hearth spat and hissed, throwing long, lonely shadows across the one-room home. She had thought herself used to the quiet by now, but that night, it felt heavier, like the earth itself was holding its breath. She was alone, a widow on land too dry to feed her soul and too wild to ever let her forget it. Her husband, Samuel, had been gone 2 winters now, taken by fever and buried beneath a frozen hill that even coyotes avoided. She talked to him sometimes when the loneliness pressed too hard, but tonight not even his memory could comfort her. The cold was too cruel for that. Then, through the roar of wind came a sound that didn't belong. At first she thought it was the creak of the barn roof or the groan of a tree limb. But there it was again, a low broken cry, a horse struggling. Then a man's voice, deep and faint, swallowed by the storm. Nora froze, her heart thudding hard. "Lord help me," she whispered. She grabbed her lantern, pulling her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The cold bit at her face like knives. She could barely see beyond a few feet, but the sound guided her. She trudged through knee-deep drifts until the yellow light fell upon a dark shape in the snow. A horse on its side, its flanks heaving, steam rising from its body. And beside it, half buried in white, lay a man. He wasn't moving. Nora set the lantern down and dropped to her knees, brushing snow from his face. His skin was dark, his cheekbones sharp, his lips cracked and blue. There was blood along his temple. Half frozen, and his clothes, buckskin, worn and torn, were stiff with ice. An Apache. Every story she'd ever heard came back to her at once. Raiders, killers, thieves. But as she pressed her ear close, she heard the faintest breath escape his lips. Alive. Barely. She should have walked away. That was what the neighbors would have said if she still had any left to tell her so. The army men who patrolled the trail had warned her enough times. If you see one of them, don't play the Good Samaritan. They don't thank you for it. But standing there, with the storm swallowing the world and that man half dead before her, something stronger than fear stirred in her chest. Maybe pity, maybe stubbornness, maybe the ghost of the husband who used to call her foolhardy Nora when she couldn't turn away from a lost creature. "Come on, then," she muttered. "If death wants you, he'll have to fight me for it." She hooked her arms under his shoulders, grunting with effort, and began dragging him toward the cabin. He was heavy, muscle and frozen leather, and by the time she reached the porch, her breath came in ragged gasps. She kicked the door open, half stumbled inside, and shut out the wind with a slam. The firelight painted his skin in copper and shadow. Nora rolled him near the hearth, pried off his stiff boots, and cut away the blood-crusted buckskin with her shears. The sight of him made her blush and tremble, so much strength wasted by cold. But she forced herself to think like a healer, not a woman. She wrapped him in blankets, pressed warm cloths to his chest, and poured a little whiskey between his lips. Hours passed. She fed the fire, changed the compresses, whispered prayers she hadn't said since Samuel's last breath. Just before dawn, he stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, dark and wild as night. He looked at her, not with confusion, not even fear, but with the quiet pride of a man who was used to command. His voice came rough, scraped raw by cold and pain. "Water," that was all, one word. But the way he said it, low, certain, made her feel as though she'd summoned something greater than a man. Something dangerous, ancient, and alive. And as the first light of morning broke through the frosted window, Nora Whitfield realized the truth. She hadn't rescued a stranger. She'd brought the storm itself into her home. For 2 days and nights the storm raged without mercy, burying the valley beneath a blanket of silence so thick that even the coyotes dared not cry. Inside the cabin, Nora Whitfield fought her own battle, not against the cold, but against death itself. The Apache lay motionless on her cot, wrapped in every quilt she owned. His skin burned hot with fever. His breath came shallow and ragged. Nora wiped his forehead with snow-melt water, whispering small comforts as if words could call him back from the edge. "You'll live," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if it was a promise or a plea. "You've got a look about you like a man too stubborn to die." Sometimes he muttered in his own tongue, a rhythm she couldn't understand. Sharp syllables, spoken like commands. Other times he called out a name, Tayen or something close to it. Whoever she was, Nora figured he was seeing her in the fever dreams that twisted through his mind. When she wasn't tending to him, she kept her rifle close. Not that it made much sense. If he meant her harm, she'd have been dead already. Still, the stories she'd heard around campfires and trading posts weren't easy to forget. Apaches don't show mercy, the man used to say. You cross one and he'll carve your name in the dirt before the sun sets. But this man didn't look like a killer now. He looked human, fragile even. His long black hair was tangled and full of frost, his hands calloused but trembling. There was a scar along his ribs, deep old, and a newer one at his shoulder like he'd been shot not long ago. Nora cleaned the wound carefully, wrapping it tight with strips torn from her petticoat. You're lucky I've a soft spot for fools, she said under her breath, and that the good Lord gave me a mule's sense of duty. By the third night, the storm began to ease. The wind quieted, leaving behind a kind of stillness that only comes after nature's fury has spent itself. Nora sat by the hearth, needle in hand, mending her only good blanket. She could feel his gaze before she realized he was awake. He was watching her. His eyes, dark as wet obsidian, followed her hands, her face, the rise and fall of her breath. When their gazes met, she felt a strange jolt run through her, sharp as the bite of cold air. You're awake, she said softly. He didn't answer right away. His expression stayed unreadable. Then with a dry, rasping voice, he said, Where is this place? My cabin, she replied, setting the needle down. You were near froze to death out in the storm. I brought you in. He blinked slowly as though weighing her words. You saved me, Nora shrugged. Wouldn't call it saving. More like giving you a fighting chance. A flicker of something, amusement maybe, touched his eyes. Why? The question caught her off guard. Why, she echoed. Because I'm not heartless, that's why. He said nothing more, but his gaze stayed on her, steady and intense. It wasn't suspicion. It was something quieter. Calculation. Understanding. After a moment, he reached for the cup of water beside him. His hand trembled. Nora stepped forward and helped him lift it to his lips. His skin brushed hers. Warm, rough, alive. And for a fleeting instant, she felt her heart stumble in her chest. When he finished drinking, he looked down at his chest, tracing the marks she'd noticed before. Painted symbols in faded ochre. They looked ceremonial, sacred even. You shouldn't have done this, he murmured. Nora frowned. Done what? Taken me in, helped me. The soldiers will not forgive you for it. She laughed without humor. Soldiers don't come this far out. And I sure don't give a damn what they think. He met her eyes again, something dark flickering in his expression. You do not understand, he said softly. If I live, they will come. The words hung in the cabin like smoke. Nora wanted to ask what he meant, but he leaned back, exhaustion dragging him down again. As the fire crackled low, she sat there watching him, her mind full of questions and her heart full of unease. She'd saved him out of kindness or maybe loneliness, but now, with every slow, steady breath he took, she began to wonder what she'd truly invited into her home. When dawn broke, pale and cold, Nora stepped outside to gather wood. From the ridge above her cabin, she saw it. Hoof prints. Not one set, but 3. Riders had been there, watching through the storm. And she knew then that the man lying in her bed wasn't just another wanderer lost to the cold. He was someone important, someone the world wanted dead, and she had brought him back to life. The days crept by slow and cold, the storm leaving behind a world that glittered under the sun like glass. The snow outside the cabin shone so bright it hurt to look at, but inside the light was soft, flickering, alive. Nora had grown used to the rhythm of her strange new life. Firewood, broth, silence, and the watchful presence of the man she'd saved. He still hadn't told her his name. She called him the stranger in her thoughts, though that word no longer fit. The fever had broken, his strength was returning, and each day his eyes followed her with the quiet awareness of a man who missed nothing. He moved differently now, slower, deliberate, as though measuring every motion. He could speak English better than he let on, she was sure of it. When she asked him simple things, "Are you hungry? Does the wound hurt?" he would answer in short words, but his tone always carried something unspoken. That morning, as she poured hot coffee into a tin cup, she noticed him sitting up for the first time without help. His bare chest caught the firelight, the ochre marking still faintly visible. Symbols of power, she thought. Not just decoration. You shouldn't strain yourself, she said, setting the cup beside him. He accepted it with a nod. You treat me like I am weak. Nora arched an eyebrow. You were half dead when I found you. Forgive me for assuming you're not made of iron. For the first time, a faint smile touched his lips, quick but real. It startled her how it changed his face. Without the hardness, he looked almost boyish. Almost. I do not remember falling, he said after a pause, voice low and rough. Only the cold. The horse ran. Then nothing. Well, you were lucky I heard you, she replied. Or unlucky, depending on what kind of man you are. He looked at her then, long enough that she felt her breath tighten. You believe I am a bad man? I don't know what to believe, she admitted. You haven't told me much. He set down the cup and leaned forward slightly. You have courage, white woman. Name's Nora, she said. He repeated it slow and careful, as though tasting it. Nora. His accent gave it a strange music, soft but deep. That night when he slept, she heard him speak again, this time in his own tongue. His voice was low, rhythmic, like a chant or a prayer. Then came a name again. Tyen. He said it with grief, with something that sounded like guilt. Nora sat up on her cot, listening, her heart caught between curiosity and sorrow. Whoever Tyen was, she must have meant something to him. A wife, a lover, a sister? In the gray light of dawn, she saw him sitting by the window, awake. You talk in your sleep, she said gently. He didn't look at her. Dreams are not for others to hear. She wanted to ask more, but something in his tone stopped her. Instead, she brought him breakfast, cornbread and dried venison, and sat across from him. After a long silence, he asked, You live alone? She nodded. My husband's been gone 2 years. Fever took him. He bowed his head slightly. Among my people, a spirit walks beside a widow for 1 winter. Then she must let him go, or she will follow him. Seems I already followed him far enough, she said with a sad smile. The stranger's eyes softened. You are strong, he said simply. For reasons she couldn't explain, the words warmed her more than the fire ever could. By evening, she found herself humming as she worked, as if the quiet between them was no longer heavy but peaceful. Yet every now and then she'd catch him studying her, not with lust or threat, but with the weight of a man who saw more than he said. It unnerved her. And yet she didn't turn away. When she went out to fetch water that night, the air had gone still. Too still. From the ridge above her cabin came a faint glint of movement, like metal catching moonlight. A rifle barrel. Nora froze, her breath fogging in the cold. She turned back toward the cabin and saw the stranger standing in the doorway, bare-chested, his dark hair falling over his shoulders. He'd seen it too. Inside, he said, his voice suddenly all command, all power. She obeyed without thinking. The fire behind him cast his shadow long across the floorboards, and for the first time she saw not a wounded man, but something else entirely. A leader. A warrior. Someone whose enemies watched from the hills and whose silence hid more than she could imagine. And as the night deepened, Nora realized with a slow chill that she hadn't rescued a victim at all. She had rescued danger, and danger had just decided to stay. The snow had melted into frozen rivulets, the world outside turning from silver to muddy brown, but inside Nora Whitfield's cabin, a new kind of storm was brewing. The stranger she had rescued was no longer a man clinging to life. He moved with a strength that made the floorboards creak beneath him, and a calm that unsettled her more than the howling blizzard ever had. One afternoon, as she chopped firewood near the edge of the clearing, she saw them, 3 figures on horseback, silent as shadows riding along the ridge above her cabin. Her first instinct was fear, soldiers no doubt, or scouts hunting the Apache. She stopped mid-swing, gripping the axe, her heart hammering like a wild stallion. But it wasn't the stranger who had saved her in the snow who was the concern. It was him, the stranger's silence, that made her wonder, the way the men approached him with deference. Kohana. The riders dismounted gracefully, bowing their heads in reverence as he approached. The air itself seemed to bend to him. Nora blinked in disbelief. He was no ordinary man, not a wandering warrior. He was a chief, a ruler of the territory. The tattoos on his chest and arms, the ochre and ash designs she had only noticed in flashes, were symbols of authority, of leadership and sacred vows. Even in the small cabin warmed by her fire, the weight of his presence pressed down on her like the mountain itself. You are their chief? She stammered, stepping forward, her voice trembling despite herself. He looked at her calmly, eyes dark and unwavering. I am Nantan, he said in English, his voice low but commanding. Chief of this land. You have seen me wounded. That is enough for now. The rider stood silently behind him, watching her, waiting for him to speak. And when he did, it was not a command to attack, but a command to respect. They obeyed without hesitation. Nora felt her stomach tighten. She had saved a man out of compassion, yet the very act of saving him had brought her into a world she did not understand. A world of warriors, of laws she had never been taught, of debts that were spoken in blood and honor. You should not have brought him here, Nantan said quietly, almost to himself as though he were acknowledging a mistake. I didn't know who you were, she said, finding her courage. I only knew you would die if I didn't help. He studied her, his gaze unyielding. Then slowly a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. You have courage, Nora Whitfield, he said. And courage is rare among your people. It was not flattery. It was observation. And in that observation lay a weight she could not lift. Over the next few days, the Apache scouts became a regular presence, moving silently through the trees and hills, always watching, always aware. They treated her with respect, never speaking ill, but Nora felt their scrutiny as keenly as any rifle sight. Every movement she made, every step outside was observed. She realized that her kindness had made her visible, not just to Nantan, but to the entire network of his people. One evening, as the sun set behind the jagged mesas, painting the valley in gold and crimson, Nantan spoke again. Among my people, he said, to save a life is to enter into a bond. You saved me, Nora. You have altered the path of your life without knowing it. She shivered, not from cold, but from the implication. Altered the path of her life. How? She had saved a man. She had not intended to invite him into her world. And yet here he stood, silent and powerful, a living reminder that her choices carried weight she could not yet measure. That night, as she lay awake listening to the fire crackle and the wind sigh through the valley, she understood the truth. She had not merely rescued a wounded stranger. She had rescued a ruler, a man whose power stretched across mountains and plains, and that act of mercy had changed her life forever, though she could not yet see how. Outside, the moon rose pale and cold, and in the shadows, Nantan's scouts returned to their silent vigil, and Nora Whitfield felt the first stirrings of fear and fascination at the man she had saved. She had opened her door to a stranger, and that stranger had opened the door to an entirely new world. The sun had barely crested the mesas when the truth of her situation began to weigh heavily on Nora Whitfield. The snow was gone, the land thawing into a rugged patchwork of brown and green, but her heart felt the chill of a debt she didn't yet understand. Nantan, the Apache chief she had saved, had begun to recover fully, and with his strength returning came a quiet intensity that made every glance between them electric. It started one morning as she handed him a tin cup of coffee. He took it slowly, savoring it in a way that made her realize he was assessing more than the drink. He was assessing her. You saved me, he said softly. Now I owe you. Nora frowned. Owe me? She repeated, setting down her own cup. I don't understand. I didn't do it for anything in return. He inclined his head slightly, the ochre tattoos on his chest catching the firelight. Among my people, a life saved is a bond. You have saved me. That debt must be repaid. Her stomach tightened. She had read enough tales to know that among Apache, debts were not casual gestures. They were sacred, lifelong obligations, enforced by honor, blood, and sometimes by force. I didn't ask for your life, she said softly. I only did what I could. His gaze held hers, unyielding, and something about it made her feel as though he could see into her very soul. It is not the asking that matters, he said. It is the giving. You risked yourself for me. That is enough to bind us. For days, Nora tried to ignore the weight of his words. She went about her chores, gathered firewood, tended to the few animals she had, and attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But normalcy had fled the day she pulled a nearly frozen Apache from the snow. Now she lived with the constant pressing awareness that she was tied to a man whose reach and power she barely understood. One afternoon, Nantan asked her to sit by the fire as he spoke in halting English. "You fear me," he said. "I can see it, and yet you do not run." "I'm not a child," she replied, though her voice wavered. "I can take care of myself." He leaned back, studying the flicker of flames, then looked at her again. "No, you are brave. But bravery has a cost. A debt is not paid with words, Nora Whitfield. It is paid with life, with loyalty, with presence." She shivered despite the heat of the fire. The implication was clear. She could leave the cabin, walk away from the man she had saved, but his code would follow her. She would never be free of the bond that her own hands had created. That night, as she lay awake listening to the wind sigh across the valley, she thought of Samuel, her late husband. He had taken his debts seriously, but none had tied him so tightly to a living man as this. An Apache chief, a ruler of the land, a force she could neither control nor escape. She realized with a pang that she had not merely saved a life. She had invited responsibility, danger, and an unspoken claim into her home. The next morning, scouts appeared on the ridge again, and Nora's unease deepened. Nantan's men moved silently through the trees, watching, waiting, guarding him, and by extension her. She felt herself becoming part of a world she did not belong to, a life that had no room for hesitation. One evening, Nantan spoke again, his voice calm, but filled with the weight of authority. "The debt will find you," he said. "Even if you run, even if you think to hide, you have saved me. You are bound." Nora closed her eyes, the words settling into her chest like heavy stones. She had wanted only to do what was right, and yet, the right thing had drawn her into the orbit of a man who could claim her loyalty as easily as he could command the valley. For the first time, she understood the depth of the bond she had created. A life saved was more than a gesture. It was a promise, a tether, a chain forged by mercy and courage, and one she could not break. And as the fire sputtered low that night, Nora Whitfield realized the truth. She had saved a man. But in doing so, she had also saved herself, into a life she could never escape. The valley had begun to thaw, but danger had a way of creeping in like the frost returning at night. Word of Nantan's survival, and of the woman who had nursed him back from the brink, had traveled faster than the snowmelt. Soldiers from Fort Bowie were on the move, their rifles gleaming in the weak winter sun, tracking the man they believed was a fugitive. Nora had just finished stacking firewood outside her cabin when she spotted the first plume of dust curling along the ridge. Her heart skipped a beat. 3 riders, men in uniform, eyes sharp and hands tight on their rifles. She knew them immediately. Men who would not hesitate to hang her for aiding an Apache. Men who carried the law as an excuse for vengeance. She turned to warn Nantan, but he was already at the cabin door, alert, muscles taut, eyes scanning the horizon like a predator. "Stay inside," he said, voice calm but carrying an authority that made her obey instantly. "Do not show yourself." The soldiers dismounted at the edge of the clearing. They moved with purpose, boots crunching on the frozen dirt, rifles ready. One of them shouted, "We know he's here. Step aside, woman, or you'll suffer the consequences of harboring an Apache." Nora's stomach knotted. Step aside? She couldn't, not after everything. She clenched her hands at her sides, refusing to give them the satisfaction of fear. But fear had its own way of creeping in, cold, sharp, relentless. From the shadows, Nantan emerged. No coat, no weapon at first glance, just the quiet power of a man who could bend people with his gaze. His presence made the soldiers pause, confusion flashing across their faces. They had heard rumors of the Apache who ruled these hills, but standing before them was a living, breathing force they could neither anticipate nor intimidate. "You seek a man," Nantan said, voice steady, low, commanding. "He is not yours to take." The lead soldier laughed, a hollow, nervous sound. "You'll answer for this, Apache. We'll burn your hideout, woman, and hang you for aiding him." Nantan's eyes flicked toward Nora, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a shield. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately, until he was only a few feet from the soldiers. "You will not touch her," he said. "You will not take me. Leave, or you will regret it beyond any punishment you can imagine." For a moment, time seemed suspended. The wind stopped, the dust hung in the air, and even the birds in the distant cliffs held their breath. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. None had faced this man in person before. Stories were one thing. Living power was quite another. A shot rang out not from Nantan but from a branch snapping underfoot. One of the soldiers had shifted nervously. That was all it took. Nantan's warriors, previously hidden among the trees, emerged silently, rifles and bows trained on the intruders. The soldiers froze. Their confidence faltered, replaced by the raw, unmistakable terror of being outnumbered and outmatched. "Leave," Nantan said again, each syllable a promise of consequence. "You will not touch her. You will not touch this land. Go and live with your cowardice." The soldiers hesitated, eyes wide, then slowly, begrudgingly, they backed away. Their pride bruised, they mounted their horses and disappeared down the ridge, dust curling in their wake like a retreating storm. Nora stood frozen, heart racing. She looked at Nantan, seeing not just the man who had been near death in her cabin, but the warrior who commanded life and death with a single word. He turned to her, and for the first time his expression softened. "You risked everything for me," he said quietly. "Now I save you." Her breath caught. "I don't want to be saved," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "You are already bound by the life you gave. I will not let it end here." The sun dipped behind the mesas, casting long shadows over the valley. Nora realized then that her life had irrevocably changed. She had pulled a dying man from the snow, and in doing so, had walked straight into a world where danger was constant, and loyalty demanded more than she had ever imagined. And yet, despite the fear, despite the threat of soldiers and the law, she felt a strange, undeniable certainty. With Nantan, she would survive. The trail up the red cliffs was narrow, carved by wind and water over centuries, and Nora Whitfield clutched her shawl around her shoulders as she followed Nantan. The snowmelt had made the path slick and treacherous, but she dared not speak, dared not slow her steps. Behind them, the valley stretched wide and silent, dotted with skeletal trees and the occasional frozen creek. Below, her cabin stood as a reminder of the life she had left, burned in her imagination, if not by flames, now claimed by distance. The Apache camp revealed itself gradually, hidden among the crags and mesas, smoke rising from multiple fire pits. Children ran barefoot along the rocky paths, their laughter light against the sharp cliffs. Women tended fires, prepared food, and mended clothes with careful precision. Warriors moved silently, bows strung, eyes scanning the horizon. Nora's breath caught in her chest. She had imagined savages, bloodthirsty, unwelcoming. But what she saw instead was a community bound by rules and respect, by loyalty and honor. Nantan led her to a central lodge constructed of logs and hides, larger than any structure she had imagined on the frontier. Inside, the chief's family and advisors sat around a low fire. They greeted her with quiet curiosity, watching her with measured glances. Nora forced herself to meet their eyes, offering a polite nod. Her tongue felt clumsy with words, as if her voice did not belong in this place. One woman, tall and striking, with hair braided tightly down her back, stepped forward. Her eyes were sharp, assessing. "Who is this?" she asked in Nantan's tongue. Nora realized immediately she was being judged, not for skill but for intrusion. "She saved me," Nantan replied simply. "She brought me back from death." The woman's gaze swept over Nora's face, taking in the calluses, the worn dress, the dirt smudged across her hands. "A white woman," she said finally, tone laced with both warning and curiosity. "She does not belong here." Nora swallowed hard but held her posture. "I did what I had to do," she said, her English clear but careful. "He would have died without me." The woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly, signaling acceptance, though not warmth. Children approached tentatively, offering small gifts, turquoise beads, dried corn, feathers. Nora accepted them with quiet gratitude, feeling the first warmth of belonging she had felt since her husband's death. That evening, she sat near the fire with Nantan, watching the tribe move with rhythm and purpose. Women cooked and wove, men repaired tools. Children played with laughter that rang like music across the canyon. The community had a cohesion she had never seen among settlers, an unspoken understanding that each person's survival was tied to the next. "You are not like my people," Nantan said quietly, his eyes tracing the flicker of flames. "Your ways are strange to them." "I am not meant to be," Nora replied softly, staring into the fire. "But I did not choose this life. It chose me," he inclined his head. "Your courage has earned you a place here for now. But not all will welcome it. Some will test you. Some will wish you gone. She glanced at him. Test me? Some believe a woman like you cannot be trusted, he said. Others fear your presence will stir jealousy or anger. They will watch you, question you, see where your loyalty lies. You have entered a world that does not forgive weakness. Nora shivered. She understood then that saving Nantan had not just saved a life. It had thrust her into a society with rules she had never learned. A world where every action carried meaning, and every glance could hold judgment. She had left the valley below, but she had entered a different kind of wilderness. A wilderness of honor, power, and tradition. As she lay down that night in the lodge, the warmth of the fire and the murmur of the camp lulling her to sleep, she realized that she was no longer alone. She had found protection, yes, but also scrutiny. And with that scrutiny came understanding. Survival here required more than courage. It required adaptation, and she would learn. For the first time since the blizzard, Nora felt the sharp thrill of possibility. She was among the Apache now. And the life she thought she knew had changed forever. The fire crackled low in the central lodge, sending shadows dancing along the walls of hide and timber. Nora Whitfield sat across from Nantan, the Apache chief she had saved, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The camp outside had quieted for the night, children sleeping, fires dimming, but inside the tension between them hummed in the air like a living thing. For days, she had observed him, seen the way his eyes followed her silently, noting every movement, felt the unspoken weight of his presence, a kind of power that demanded attention and respect. And now sitting before him in the warm glow of firelight, she realized she had underestimated him entirely. "You lied to me," she said softly, breaking the heavy silence. "You let me think you were just a wounded stranger, a man in need." He looked at her steadily, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "I was wounded," he said, voice low, calm. "But you do not understand. I am more than a man needing aid. I am Nantan, chief, leader, protector. I don't care what you are," she said, frustration slipping into her voice. "I cared for you because you were human. Because I wouldn't leave you to die." He leaned back slightly, the firelight casting deep shadows across his strong features. "And in doing so, you made a choice that cannot be undone." Nora's throat tightened. "Choice? I did not choose to be part of your world." "You did," he said softly, but with an authority that brooked no argument. "By saving me, you entered it. And now you are here. I cannot undo what you have done, nor would I want to." The words left her reeling. Part of her wanted to flee, to return to the valley below and the small, solitary life she had carved from grief. But another part, the part that had stirred when she first saw him awake by the fire in her cabin, knew that she could not. That her heart, stubborn as it was, had already become entangled in his world. She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the flickering flames. "I didn't know who you were," she admitted quietly. "I thought I was saving a man, not a chief, not someone whose enemies would come for him." He studied her, the shadows of the fire tracing his sharp cheekbones and the faint tattoos on his chest. Then, for the first time, he smiled, a slow, faint curl of his lips that softened his otherwise unreadable face. "I am alive because of you," he said. "You brought me back from the edge of death. And in doing so, you brought me back to myself. You are the reason I breathe still." Nora's hands clenched in her lap. "I am no one," she whispered. "A widow. A woman alone. What could I possibly mean to a man like you?" He leaned forward, the firelight catching the dark glint in his eyes. "You are no one," he repeated, his voice low, resonant. "You do not understand. You are the woman who restored a life. The woman who defied fear. The woman who has claimed a place in my heart, whether you know it or not." The words hit her like a blow, and yet a strange warmth followed, spreading through her chest. She had feared him, respected him, admired him, but never realized the depth of what had begun between them. She began, then faltered, unsure how to speak aloud the tumult of emotion. She barely understood herself. He reached across the small space between them, his hand brushing hers, not roughly, not possessively, but deliberately, like a silent promise. "Do not deny it," he said softly. "You are here. You have given life, and now you are part of my world." Nora's heart pounded. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across the walls, across their faces, across a chasm of uncertainty, now bridged by unspoken confession. She realized with a sudden clarity that she was no longer just a rescuer. She was a participant, a witness, and perhaps a partner in a bond that would shape the days to come. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. In the firelight, beside the man she had saved, she felt a spark of something dangerous, something undeniable, and she knew deep in her soul that nothing, neither fear nor law nor solitude, would ever be the same again. Dawn broke over the mesas like a blade of gold slicing through the lingering chill. The Apache camp stirred, the children's laughter carrying faintly on the wind, the women tending fires and mending clothes, the warriors sharpening blades and checking weapons. Nora Whitfield moved among them with a careful grace, aware more than ever of the delicate balance she now inhabited. She was not just a visitor here, she was a witness, a participant, and in ways she did not fully understand, a part of Nantan's world. Yet the valley below, the one she had called home, the one that still held her burned cabin and the faint memories of Samuel, pulled at her heart like a stubborn tether. She had lived there all her life, carving survival from dirt and frost. Could she now abandon that life entirely to live among people she barely understood, bound to a man whose power and honor she both feared and admired? The answer came abruptly, as it often does in the West, in the form of smoke rising along the ridge. Soldiers. Their rifles glinted in the morning sun. Their horses kicked up dust that swirled across the camp like a warning. Nora froze. She felt the old pulse of fear, but it was tempered by the growing knowledge that her heart no longer beat solely for safety. It beat for Nantan. Nantan appeared at her side, silent as shadow, eyes sweeping across the approaching threat. "They have come," he said simply. "They'll burn the camp," she whispered. "They will not," he corrected, his voice calm but filled with steel. "If we must fight, it will be on our terms. But you—" He looked at her, gaze locking with hers, sharp and unyielding. "You must choose. You can go with me into the fight, or you can return to the valley below. Once you step into this conflict, there is no turning back." Nora's chest tightened. She had imagined this choice countless times in the silent nights before. Stay in the valley, live quietly, mourn the life she had lost, or step fully into the storm that Nantan embodied. Now faced with the reality of soldiers advancing, the choice had become urgent, unavoidable. She began, but words failed her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, warm and firm. "You have already chosen, whether you know it or not," he said softly. "Every step you took to care for me, every risk you embraced, it bound you to me, to this world, to this fight." Her heart leapt. Fear warred with desire. Instinct battled courage, but in the clarity of that moment she understood. She had saved a man, yes, but she had also saved herself into a life that was no longer hers alone. "I will fight with you," she said finally, voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "I will not hide." Nantan's eyes softened, a flicker of approval and something deeper, a bond forged by shared risk and unspoken understanding. "Then you must follow closely," he said. "Your safety is my responsibility. But your courage, it will be tested." The soldiers advanced, shouting commands, their rifles raised. Nantan's warriors moved silently through the rocks, bows strung, eyes sharp as hawks. Nora followed, clutching her own rifle, heart pounding in rhythm with the battle drums of the earth itself. She felt fear, yes, but she also felt a strange exhilaration. The first taste of belonging, of purpose, of loyalty that transcended personal survival. As the first shots rang out, the choice was made not with words but with action. Nantan led his warriors like a force of nature, every movement deliberate, every command unchallenged. Nora found herself running alongside him, her rifle ready, her pulse quickened by adrenaline and the certainty that she was part of something larger than herself. For the first time, she realized the truth of Nantan's bond, the debt of life she had incurred. She could never return to the valley below, not fully. Her life had split into two, the life she had known and the life she had chosen. And in choosing, she had found courage, love, and an unshakable connection to the man she had saved. By midday, the soldiers had been repelled, retreating in confusion and fear. Nora stood beside Nantan, panting, bloodied, exhilarated, and alive in a way she had never been in the quiet valley below, and she knew without doubt that the choice she had made would define the rest of her life. She belonged to his world now, and there was no turning back. The battle had ended, but the valley still trembled with the echoes of gunfire and shouting. Smoke drifted lazily over the mesa, carrying the acrid scent of burned brush and trodden earth. Nora Whitfield stood beside Nantan, her hands still trembling from exertion and adrenaline, her heart beating in a rhythm that matched his steady, commanding presence. She had fought, survived, and most dangerously she had chosen. The Apache chief turned to her, the firelight of their small camp catching the sharp lines of his face, the tattoos that marked him as ruler of this land, and the intensity in his dark eyes that made her pulse quicken. He did not speak at first, allowing the silence to stretch heavy and intimate. The men of his tribe lingered nearby, their eyes respectful, aware of the bond forming in quiet moments between the warrior and the woman who had saved him. Finally, Nantan spoke. "You have stood beside me through fire, through fear, and through death," he said. His voice was low, resonant, carrying the weight of authority and the raw intimacy of shared peril. "You could have returned to your valley, your home, and your solitude. But you did not. You chose to remain, to stand, to fight." Nora swallowed hard, feeling the truth of his words deep in her chest. "I had no other choice," she admitted softly. I couldn't leave you. Not after everything." A small, rare smile curved his lips. "And that is why you are mine." The words were not harsh nor commanding. They were a declaration, a claim spoken as a man who could stake his authority not with law but with life itself. Nora felt her pulse catch in a way she had never known. The valley, the cabin, the world she had known, everything had faded. In this moment there was only him, only the life she had chosen, and only the bond forged in snow, blood, and fire. "You
claim me?"
she whispered, the word both thrilling and terrifying. "I do," he said simply. "You saved my life. You honored the bond between us. And now, by the laws of my people, you belong to me." Nora's mind raced. Memories of the blizzard, the frozen wilderness, the hours spent nursing him back from the brink, and the quiet confessions by firelight, all converging to make the impossible feel inevitable. She had feared him, admired him, and, in ways she did not fully understand until now, loved him. I accept," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am yours, Nantan. Whatever that means. I choose it." The chief's eyes softened, the sharp intensity giving way to a rare tenderness. He reached for her hand, large and calloused, and held it as though it were a treasure more valuable than any land or weapon. "You are brave, Nora Whitfield," he said. "Braver than most who walk the earth. You have risked everything, and in doing so, you have given me more than life. You have given me trust, loyalty, and heart." She felt tears sting her eyes, unashamed as the weight of the words, the moment, and the life they had fought to preserve settled upon her. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that love and loyalty could coexist with danger, that life could be shared in its fullest, rawest form, and that her courage, her audacity, had earned her a place beside a man who was as commanding as the land itself. Nantan drew her close, their foreheads touching, the wind whispering across the mesa as if it too acknowledged the union forged in fire and snow. Around them, the tribe watched with silent approval, understanding that this claim was not merely a matter of possession but of honor, of life, of the sacred bond that had been formed in the coldest and harshest of conditions. Nora Whitfield breathed deeply, feeling the warmth of his body, the pulse of his heart against her own, and the undeniable truth that she was no longer a widow alone in the snow. She was part of something greater, a world that demanded courage and rewarded loyalty, a life intertwined irrevocably with the man she had saved, and who had, in turn, claimed her heart. The wind swept across the mesas, carrying the faint scent of pine smoke and possibility, and as Nantan tightened his hold around her, Nora realized the certainty of her new life. She had chosen, she had fought, she had loved, and she had been claimed. In the frozen wilderness, in the heart of the Apache lands, she had found her place, and nothing, neither snow nor soldiers nor solitude, would ever take it away.